This is Sunday School Wine Radio with special guest Jeff Vejr of Golden Cluster. Welcome. This is Sunday School Wine Radio with your hosts,
Mallory.
And me, Martin. This is a show bringing you the people and personalities who are stirring things up in the wine world of the Pacific Northwest. So anyone who's been to one of our Sunday school classes knows that I'm a bit of a history buff. One thing that interests me in particular is the history of Oregon wine. And that's not just the modern history that people talk about beginning in the 1960s, but the stuff that went on beforehand, some of the pre-Prohibition history dating back to the 1800s. It's a story that not a lot of people know, and it doesn't get talked about that much. One man who knows the ins and outs is our guest today, a winemaker who makes his wines at a historical vineyard. He also makes dozens of styles of wines, many using vines planted in the 60s, and many using obscure grapes. The man is Jeff Vejr of label Golden Cluster. Welcome, Jeff.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. So before we get started on the history, let's talk about you for a second. So how long have you been doing Golden Cluster?
So the Golden Cluster brand started in the 2013 vintage. Prior to that, I'd actually blended and made some wine in France and in Spain. And my focus was really about old vines. I was really sort of obsessed with this concept of vines that were over 100 years old. And I didn't really think there was much around here that, fit that bill. And so it wasn't until I had toured the David Hill Vineyard with Barnaby Tuttle of Teutonic Wine Company. And he was kind of showing off some of the old vines that he was working with. He was working with Sylvaner and Chasselas. And we were rounding the corner of the winery, and we came across these vines that were just more massive than any of the other vines that we had witnessed. And we just kind of casually asked the vineyard manager, hey, what grape is this? And vineyard managers looked at us and just very, calmly said, oh, this is our Semillon, as if we should have known it was already there. And both Barney and I just kind of looked at each other and we were stunned. I mean, Semillon just happens to be one of my favorite white grapes. And I was just shocked to learn that, these vines had been up there since 1966 and I hadn't seen any wines from it. So, Barnaby and I left that vineyard that day, got back to Portland. And then on that trip back, we had, made a concrete decision that, we need to call up there tomorrow and see if they'll sell us the grapes. So sure enough, Barnaby called the next day and asked, hey, can I buy these Semillon vines from you? And their first question was, why would you want the Semillon? And that really kind of kickstarted Golden Cluster in 2013. So without Barnaby Tuttle from Teutonic Wine Company, Golden Cluster wouldn't exist.
Oh, what a good guy.
Yeah, all thanks to Mr. Tuttle.
And there was a bit that we might have perused over on your website about how you almost went to Australia previous to that. What was that? So did you just ditch your whole entire Australia trip just because of these old Semillon vines?
Correct. Yeah, that was the plan. The plan in 2013 was to go back over to Australia and work with Gary Mills from Jamshed Winery, and I was going to make an old vine Riesling and an old vine Sylvaner from a vineyard that he sourced from in the Macedon Range in Victoria. And when the opportunity to source old vines, truly old vines for Oregon, was presenting itself to me, I just felt my duty was to stay here and to explore this concept of old vines in Oregon, and those being some of arguably the oldest vines post-Prohibition. This is why I decided to stay here, and the project kind of spiraled out of control after that. That's where I was able to spend more time in that vineyard, and I was able to see that they had Flora there, which is a really rare American wine grape. And then I was able to, over the course of 3 years, officially identify extremely rare grape called Sauvignon Rose. They had one row of it up there. And then in 2015 was the first time that actually got separated out and made into a single varietal wine.
That's so cool. I love that all this stuff you just discovered in your own backyard. That's just really cool.
I think that was kind of the surprising thing for me, right? I mean, we hear these stories about what supposedly exists here, and most of the focus tends to be on, Pinot Noir and Pinot Gris and lesser extent Chardonnay these days. But in fact, most of our history are not those grapes. We have a longer time period working with more Alsatian or Germanic grapes and other American grapes than anything else. And to learn that all these grapes had been there, and they've been there since 1966, was quite a bit of a shock to me. And so it's really one of the only other reasons why I decided to stay, is explore a wider version of the Oregon story, not post-Prohibition, but also pre-Prohibition.
Mm-hmm.
What is it about the old vines that attracts you?
I just think it's the concept of a plant that's older than you, and you're drinking a beverage that, somebody's grandparent or great-great-grandparent helped plant. I'm a big history buff, much like yourself, and very much into my own genealogy. And so these kind of concepts of multi-generational pursuits are really fascinating to me. And wine is one of those professions where you can plant something, not for yourself, not for your kids, not for your grandkids, but for your great-great-grandchildren. Mm-hmm. And this is really where, at the core, what most viniculturists were doing back in the day. They weren't planting for themselves, unlike today. They were planting for future generations.
Does an old vine make any difference to the wine?
So I used to believe that, yes, it did. And in certain cases, I still do believe that. But young vines can also express quite an extraordinary level of nuance. But similar to humans, they kind of go through these growth phases, if you will. When they get to be those teenage years, they're just kind of ornery and they just don't really want to express themselves, and they're kind of shut down. And then as the vine matures, you do get these, no different than us, you get more nuance. There's more layers there. And old vines, to me, represent a truly sustainable agricultural model.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess, were you into history at school? Was that something you were into? How
Yes,
far does this go back?
Yeah, my major is in international studies. So I have quite a deep appreciation for history. But I grew up in New Hampshire, and the house I grew up in was built in 1826. And so I was surrounded by things that were hundreds of years older than me, and hundreds of years older than my parents. And so when that history is surrounding you, you really can only embrace it, learn from it, and appreciate it. And so I just come from a place where that's the norm. And when I moved to Oregon, it was the most shocking thing to me, is how everything was so new, so fresh, so alive. And there's a freedom in that, of course, but the grounding effect of some of these old farmhouses that I grew up in were memories that I hold dear, and so they just sort of migrate out into my obsession with old vines and old wine regions and old wine styles, old wine vessels. It all exposes itself in that.
I'm just thinking about, in terms of the wine industry here, not having a tradition is actually what some people like. That's why we see quite a lot of French winemakers, prestigious ones, coming here, because they don't have all the rules that they do in France.
It's 100% right. Yeah, I think that's also, for me, the argument why we shouldn't resolve ourselves to thinking that we've figured everything out with 2 or 3 grapes. I like to remind people, Oregon is actually more like France than anywhere else. We have quite the diverse growing regions here. We have perfect growing conditions for what I like to call natural wine growing. And that is, by and large, we do not have to irrigate our vineyards. And non-irrigated vines is the standard in Europe. And surprisingly, it's the exception here in the United States. Oregon is really one of the only states where you can successfully dry farm on a wide scale. So conversely, we can grow many fantastic wine grapes from around the world naturally, and then hopefully make a wine that is reminiscent of the origins of where that grape comes from.
And would you say that irrigation interferes with that? Is that what you're saying there?
Yes, 100%. Irrigation is a dilution of flavor in the wine grape. And it does allow certain grapes to be planted where they normally wouldn't be able to grow because they would either ripen way too early, and the sugars would spike and the acids would drop out. And so if you're continuing to irrigate, you're allowing an artificial growing pattern of that vine that traditionally wouldn't have it if it didn't have water.
So let's talk a little bit about Oregon wine history. So you've dug back into this, probably I don't know as much as anybody else, but a lot, and you've traced. You've done a lot of primary research that a lot of other people don't do because they just tend to read the other books that have been written on it. And so you found some things that are different. to what's been written. And so that
Yeah. Sorry, is
Go
that
on.
okay? I just want to clarify for our readers and our listeners as well that Martin and I, especially Martin, the other Mr. History buff here, has done so much research digging into basically everything we could find at the Multnomah County Library and journals, et cetera, and then you see all of these conflicting kind of things, and you kind of put together like it could be this, and then we come out and say something, and then Jeff comes along and he's like, well, actually, we're just like, how does he know all of this? It's crazy. So anyway, I just wanted
Mr.
to
Contrary.
yeah, Mr. Contrary.
Yeah, I think what was surprising to me when you kind of read some of those books that you're talking about, it's written in the premise of sort of one vision and one side. There's that old adage that when the truth and legend are in conflict, print the legend, don't print the truth. Mm-hmm. And so for me, there were always these books and these articles being written, and it was always kind of the same people that they were interviewing, and they were referencing the same things all the time. And it couldn't possibly be such a basic history that we have here, both in a modern sense and in a previous to Prohibition sense. So, I just started asking around to people that weren't being interviewed, but were around during these time periods of the early 60s and 70s. And there's a whole, wide array of opinions and experiences and stories that hadn't been told. And so that's the path that I chose to go down, was, the one that not too many people were looking at. One of those being the story about Charles Corey. When I got up to David Hill Vineyard and started exploring some of the vines that he had planted in the 60s, it was just sort of shocking to me how little people knew about him. And yet he's, one of the most important figures of the reestablishment of the modern Oregon wine industry.
We should say David Hill Vineyard is where you make your wine now. The vineyard you were talking about at the very beginning here, where you found those old Semillon vines, and it's just outside Forest Grove.
Correct. Yes, it's right behind the hills of Forest Grove. And when I got up there, yes, it was called David Hill. Prior to that, it was known as Charles Corey Vineyard, and before Prohibition, it was known as the Reuter Hill. So that specific piece of land had been a vineyard on and off for the last 150 years here in Forest Grove. And so that was the other shocking thing, and where I make my wine, there's 50 yards away is this old house that was built in 1875. And that house is what the Reuters built that house. And we have some old pictures of the vines, head train vines going right up to their porch. And so when you spend enough time out there and you visualize things, you can really feel that palpable history. And so it was just important for me to really dig deep, not only in Charles Corey's story, but dig deep and learn more about the Reuters as well.
Yeah. So as the stories go, there's one story that the first plantings in Oregon were by fur trappers in the 1820s, which I like because it's the idea that even fur trappers wanted to have a winery when they retired. I kind of like that idea. So it's not just like rich doctors and lawyers. Anyway, but by the mid 1840s, we were getting the first actual proper vineyards planted, and something that you might call a winery. Would you agree with that, or?
I don't think people have. So when we use the term winery, there was really nothing that fits that definition back then, like we enjoy now. People definitely grew grapevines along with multiple other fruits and grains. The grape was a part of a more holistic farm, a more sustainable farm. People did grow grapes, but most of the time it was for personal consumption or consumption for the people in their village. No one was really at that time making wine and shipping it down to California. That did happen later on, but in the beginning it was really about local consumption. This is why we didn't have, and even countries like Republic of Georgia, even today, bottling a wine in a glass bottle is kind of a foreign concept. Back then, it was a similar thing. People would come by and bring their ceramic jugs and fill those up, take them home, or come by with little tiny barrels and take them to their home and store it down in their cellars. But by and large, they weren't wineries like you and I would define them. They were just farms that had multiple products in them, and wine grapes being one of them.
It reminds me a little bit of maybe like Tuscany, where they'd be growing olives, but they'd also, they'd be growing other crops as well, and vines would just be part of that, of what they were doing.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, but just for the sake of the story, we do have some people in the 1840s making wine.
Probably so. My only contention with the fur trapper idea is that fur trappers are not people that just stay in one place. They move around. They will trap different things. So while that may have occurred, I can't imagine them, would they come back to it and harvest?
Well, this is
I
after
don't
they
know.
retired.
Retired fur trappers. That's a whole nother story.
Anyway, let's move on from the fur trappers. I don't want to just get caught up in that. Let's move on.
I think for old Oregon wine history, really, I tend to center around the beginnings with Henry Luling, who came across the Oregon Trail, brought grape cuttings from the Midwest and the East Coast, also brought fruit tree cuttings, and he established a nursery in Milwaukee, Oregon. And from there, they sold to a bunch of different farmers that were establishing, farmers that had gotten land rights and established farms here in the greater Willamette Valley and greater parts of Oregon. It really kind of, for me, kickstarted at that point. And then you start to see the establishment of what we would consider even vineyards to this day. So an intentional large planting of vines to produce wine grapes.
Martin loves the Henderson Llewellyn story.
I do just have to tell the story about that, just because it's so good. That he was, I think he came from Indiana, where he was involved in the what do they call it, with the when they were helping slaves escape, the Underground Railroad. Mm-hmm. Was that what it was called?
Correct.
Yeah, so he was helping out with that, and then he came west. But then at some point he decides he's going to set off and set up this free love colony. So, and he's a Quaker, but he abandons his wife and 8 kids, buys a ship, and a few people go off. They go off to Honduras to set up this free love colony that, as you might expect, doesn't quite work out. And I believe maybe he ended up dying in San Francisco, a poor man. But anyway, that was his story. That has absolutely nothing to do with Oregon wine history, but I like it anyway.
How did you come across that information? But Jeff, you have not come across.
That's a deep dive, Martin. I mean,
Yeah,
that's some
that's
real.
the good stuff.
That's the good stuff. I
That's
mean,
the good stuff.
how did I miss this?
Yeah, Who cares what?
Gosh.
Who cares what wines he brought with him?
I'm always just focusing too much on wine. I need to kind of branch out.
Yeah,
Into the
more
love.
about free love.
Yeah, you're missing out on the world there. I think it's you got to widen your horizons.
Story of my life.
Yeah. So I mean, one thing I've read that is that there were quite a few German immigrants coming in, and they were bringing their German grapes and cuttings with them. And some people thought that the Willamette Valley was, they compared it to the Rhineland, I believe.
Well, they didn't feel that there was a competitor of the Rhineland. They believed that someday it would be known as the Rhineland of America. And this isn't true just in the Willamette Valley, because you'll have to keep in mind, back in this time, prior to Prohibition, the largest concentration of vineyards and wineries was not in the Willamette Valley. It was, in fact, in southern Oregon. So down there you had the Dorners and the Von Prussels. You had the Henry Britt family outside of Jacksonville. This was the Carson family in Grants Pass. This was the bulk of the wine industry at that time period. It has since flip-flopped, where the bulk of the industry is now up in the Willamette Valley, and southern Oregon is not as vast as we have up here. But the Reuters, the Wirtz family, yes, there were definitely lots of German, Swiss, Dutch immigrants that came here, and they planted varietals that were familiar to them, along with other varietals that were available to them. So at that time, there were a lot of American wine grapes there, like Delaware, Catawba, Niagara, and then they had some grapes that would be surprising to a lot of people to learn that they had planted here. One in particular that they called out many times in these agricultural texts is Zinfandel. They had Zinfandel in the Willamette Valley prior to Prohibition, along with muscats. And then the other curious grape that they had planted up there, which when you really think about it makes a lot of sense, is they had 4 different clones of Chasselas, which is the very famous white grape from Switzerland. to call out in your agricultural text the 4 different clones of it shows you the intention that they had, and obviously they were experiencing some success with it. Whether you're talking about in Forest Grove or Mountaindale, these were areas that were filled with mostly white grapes, a little bit of red grapes, some table grapes, American grapes, and it was quite a booming industry until around 1915 when it was declared that Oregon was going to enact Prohibition, and the temperance movement kind of kicked off here a lot earlier, mostly because those Germans that came here and Swiss that came here were not Catholics. And it was the Catholics that protected wine grapes throughout Prohibition. That's why we don't have so many old vines around here. And in California they do, because the places that had these old vineyards were owned by the Catholic Church, and so those vines got to be preserved.
Because of making wine for mass, correct?
Correct, exactly. Yep, for sacramental use. Mm-hmm.
Weren't we talking about this with Matthew Rourke about old vines?
Probably.
No, I can't remember. I thought you might remember about that. Anyway, doesn't matter. That doesn't
I
matter.
have a lot of conversations these days. So
Yeah, I
blurs
know.
together.
So yeah, then yeah, it's Prohibition, and they rip out pretty much all the vines, start planting potatoes and other crops and things, and that's kind of pretty much the end of anything you could say was any kind of like Oregon wine industry until the 1960s.
Yes, when Oregon enacted Prohibition, it was the death knell to a very successful and emerging wine industry that we had here.
That's
Correct.
so sad.
And it did not return until Charles Corey and David Lett came to the Willamette Valley in 1965. And a few years earlier than that, Richard Summer down in Roseburg had planted Hillcrest Vineyard.
Do you think some of those old pre-Prohibition vines exist somewhere in Oregon, like even just like in someone's backyard or something?
Yes, they are.
Do you know of any?
Yes, they do exist. Yeah, and
Is it a big secret where they are? Someone making wine from them?
No one. They're in such small quantity, you really couldn't make a wine from them. But yes, they definitely do exist. It's another amazing part of why I like old vines is, no matter what's going on, sometimes these darn things survive and they're still kicking out fruit and cuttings, and you can, take a sample from one and root it and then create another vine, and it's a clone of that same old vine. So, yeah, that exists, and I think it's something that's, starting to be even more widely explored. We do have some pre-Prohibition vineyards that are in production. If it wasn't for the really hard work of Lonnie Wright, out at the Pines in the Gorge, he found and resurrected an old vineyard that was pre-Prohibition, and not so surprisingly, that old vineyard is Zinfandel.
And that's out in the Dalles. Is that where the vineyard is?
Correct, out in the Dalles. Yep. And if I have my story straight, that was a Italian immigrant family that came down from Washington State, settled in the Gorge, and had planted Zinfandel vines they brought from Washington State. So this was, I want to say 1858 is the date of that vineyard, the establishment of that vineyard. So you can see back then, even in the Gorge, parts of a lot of Southern Oregon and parts of the Willamette Valley had quite the successful wine history that was being established, with a variety of different grapes, a variety of different styles of wine, and lots of different people of different cultural backgrounds establishing it.
So one of the things we have now in the Oregon wine industry, I guess, is maybe not so much of that diversity, and I mean mainly because it's Pinot Noir has kind of taken over, or has been the main thing, and it's certainly been the main thing that's been promoted. I see it kind of changing a little bit now. There's people are kind of promoting more of some of the other grapes and things going on here, but Pinot's been the main story, and you've said before that the industry here doesn't really care too much for history. They just kind of like that Pinot Noir narrative, but they don't really care about the rest of it. Why do you think that is? Is that just because it's easier and you can sell more wine?
Yeah, I mean, it's an easier story to tell, right? I mean, if you try to constantly exclaim that Oregon is the New World's Burgundy, then that has a lot of marketing power, and that power has been wielded for many decades now. I always felt it was kind of a strange concept, because when people talk about Oregon wine, they're really not talking about Oregon wine. They're talking about Willamette Valley wine. And so my argument for many years, even before I was in this industry as a professional, that we should be exploring Oregon much in the way that France explores wine. Like when you think of French wine, you don't necessarily think of one grape and one style. You think of multiple grapes and multiple styles. Whether you know what the grapes are or not, you're thinking about regions, you're thinking about places. Same is true really in Italy. Oregon has all of the geographical, all of the weather, all of the environmental variables to grow multiple different styles of grapes, grow them in a world-class way, and make world-class wines from them. Why we continue to be obsessed with one particular grape at the expense of everything else, to me, is a weakness that we have in the industry. It is an unfortunate, simple story to tell. We have a wide story. We have wide successes here, and we can be seen as one of the greatest wine regions in the entire United States if we allow ourselves that type of flexibility, and to allow these stories to get out there, especially stories about how the origins of our wine industry started, and what grapes were here and what grapes are coming back now. I mean, I think a lot of people are obviously paying a lot of attention to the concept of global warming, and maybe Pinot Noir shouldn't be planted to 87% of all the vineyards in the Willamette Valley. Maybe it should be other grapes that are included in that. We have a lot of really difficult decisions to make here in a very short period of time, and my whole focus has been learning about the past and understanding how we can apply that knowledge to future endeavors. Those endeavors being, other grape varietals that maybe fit our soil types better, they fit our climate better, they fit the aesthetic of Oregon better, and long term, they are more sustainable grapes than the current story that's being told.
A few years ago, I wrote an article which was kind of around this, and it was talking about the idea of alternative grapes in Oregon, and I interviewed you for that, and I believe you were getting hate email afterwards.
Yes,
because of
yes, it's true. Yep. Yeah, I mean, I don't come out with these opinions just to be the contrarian. I mean, you just kind of look around. I always remind people, I mean, there is no limestone soils anywhere in the Willamette Valley. So right away, we're at a disadvantage to pigeonholing ourselves next to Burgundy. We have totally different weather patterns than they do. We do not have 500 years of constant cultural interest in one or two grapes. We are still at that experimental phase, even though we're just a little bit over 53 years into this modern era of Oregon wine. If we're 50 years into it, why do we have the hubris to assume that we already have figured out all of the answers? The fact of the matter is, we do not have those answers. So we should still be in small to medium size attempts. We should really be looking out to what we can do here. I don't believe what we can do is one red grape and one white grape. That to me is an insane idea that continues to be perpetuated. I do believe that Pinot Noir should be and can be planted in certain parts of the Willamette Valley and grow successfully. There's parts of the gorge that it can work in, but I think there are other grapes that have and will have much further down the line, after I'm long gone, will have established themselves here and will continue to reign supreme. I just think anytime, and it's a very American ideal, is to think about monoculture. In many things. It's in our food system. Obviously, it's in our wine system. And to tell a simple story is easy. To understand a long story and see into the future by learning from the past is something that we should all learn from, especially in the wine industry.
I've talked to people, winemakers and such from Southern Oregon, and they don't have a simple story to tell because they plant dozens of different types of grapes, and they all seem to do pretty well there. And so they were saying things like, well, should we should we focus on Tempranillo and call ourselves a Tempranillo kind of, region, that kind of thing. So there's definitely pressure from a marketing point of view to just have like the one story to tell. Just like you said, it's easier. Yeah.
That's exactly it. It's just easier. And the difficulty that Southern Oregon also faces is they have even more complex soils than we do in the Willamette Valley. There's really only 9 primary soil types in the Willamette Valley, and down in places like Umpqua Valley, Rogue Valley, Illinois Valley, there's upwards of 200 different types of soil type. It's going to take many, many, many generations of hard work and toil to really figure out what can actually work there. So you're right. The simple story is just fixate on one grape, one style of wine, and just ram it through. But that doesn't always produce great wine. It produces forced wines, and then it creates an economic system that is very, very dependent on that one thing succeeding. So why are we throwing all of our eggs in one particular basket and crossing our fingers and leaving it to other generations to have to manipulate that particular style of wine or that grape, hyper irrigating it someday maybe, to force some short-term idea of what should be done? To me, this is not a long-term successful economic strategy, and it's a terrible strategy for making world-class wine. It's something that I passionately feel that Oregon is, perfectly suited to be known as the France of the New World, or the Italy of New World, with our ability to have massive amounts of diversity and do it really, really well. It just takes a wider effort, a lot more sacrifice, a lot more creativity, and a vision that the future is bright for Oregon.
That was really good. It's almost like mic drop. Like,
yeah,
we don't even need to go
good.
anymore.
The future is bright for Oregon. Use that as a slogan.
And we're done.
You can walk out. So is this the reason why you're interested in obscure grapes?
Yeah. Sorry. You answer that question, then I'll go.
Sure. I'm interested in obscure grapes because I'm just interested in grapes, and I like learning about different wine cultures around the world and different wine styles. I mean, there's in Italy alone, there's like 2,000 different wine grapes. That's phenomenal to me. You just kind of put that up against what is grown in the Willamette Valley, and there's basically just 3 grapes. That's quite boring. You can't really learn much from that. When I started being interested and started making wine here in Oregon to quote unquote obscure grapes, mind you, Semillon's a very, very old grape. Sauvignon Rose is one of the oldest white grapes in the world. That being said, a lot of growers would contact me and say, hey, I've got, this grape that's kind of bizarre. Would you like to work with it? And I sort of became the strange wine grape guy, which was fine because I've been presented all these really incredible and rare opportunities, and I take on that challenge gratefully. But to me, it was just kind of trying to understand a wider vision of Oregon by working with the grapes that were here, had been here for 50 plus years in some cases, and in others that had just been planted in the last 7 or 8. So any opportunity to showcase a different side or different potential side of Oregon, to me, was an opportunity I couldn't pass up. So that's why Goal in the Cluster went from just making 50 to 250 cases a year to making a heck of a lot more. And instead of having one brand, I have multiple brands now. And they're all themed around this concept of, this wider vision of Oregon. That's why I try not to use the word alternative anymore. I just try to look at it as we're exploring a wider view of the bountiful energy that we have here that we just need to continue to work towards, to harness, to explore, and to get out in the marketplace to share with people. This is a world-class wine growing region. We just have to allow ourselves the freedom to do so.
We might have to change the name of our festival from Alt Wine Fest to Wider Vision Fest.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Well, speaking of certain, emails that I would receive, a year or two ago when the alt-right movement started, surfacing, I had a brand that's called Alt Oregon. And I was like, man, I got to change this name. I got to think of a better name because, Oregon already has a fractured history with that. So, why shine a light on something that has unfortunately developed a negative connotation? Yeah. So I decided, similar to Henderson Luling, I came up with my own religion, and it's called Dionystic, and it's a religion based on wine. So, yeah, there you have it. Yeah. Got to turn, lemons into lemonade sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. That's good.
Yeah.
I love it.
There's money in setting up your own religion as well.
Oh, for sure.
Big money.
Yeah.
Big money.
Just the beginning.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to talk about your wines. I just wanted to go to there because I mean, when you asked us what wines, to pick a wine from your website to bring today, and I was like, oh my God, there's 40. I literally counted. There's 45 different wines. So you definitely practice what you preach. And what's cool too is that you have like the Semillon, which is your baby inspiration catalyst grape. Which also, side note, by the way, we tried the other day and was amazing and delicious and reminded me of champagne, like all that lemon and brioche, which I'd like you to speak to in a moment. But then you have, like you had mentioned, Flora, Sauvignon Rose. Skin contact Viognier, which is actually very normal, quote unquote, relative to all these other things. Saperavi, a Georgian variety. So can you tell us a little bit about like what else stands out to you in your wide selection of those wines that you make that you're excited about?
Yeah, I think the one grape I started making, it was the first commercial release of it in the Northwest, in fact, is an Italian grape called Sagrantino. Sagrantino, similar to Saperavi, they are some of the thickest skinned wine grapes in the world. So in the case of Sagrantino, it has the highest level of resveratrol. It was primarily used as a sacramental grape. They made sacramental wines from it, and it is a beast, and it grows really, really well in the gorge. There's a vineyard in between Mosher and the Dalles where I source it from. The early results are pretty shocking, and I went to the extra step of really trying to mimic the best way I could the process that they go through to make Sagrantino. So it is a long process because of those thick skins. There's a lot of tannin there, and so it takes a lot of time for those tannins to develop and soften up and become mature enough for you to then bottle the wine and then hopefully release it. So I left those grapes. I fermented it on skins fully dry, pressed it off, and left it in barrel for 2 years, and then I bottled it, left it in bottle for another 6 months, and then released it. And that's normally not the process that most domestic wineries take. It is, unfortunately, a series of events that require you to kind of turn and burn those grapes, ferment it really quickly, get it in bottle really quickly, and try to sell it really quickly. It's all about cash flow. And as a longtime wine buyer myself, I was always so frustrated with local wineries who were just releasing wines that were, in my opinion, released way too early. They hadn't quite developed, and they weren't the best expression of what they could be. And so, I had to kind of honor that sort of stance I had taken and kind of make something that was, truly ready to drink by the time you release it. And I went even further and decided, how best can we mimic what they're doing there? We can't really get Slavonian oak barrels, so the closest we can get is the forest to the north of the Slavonian forest, which is in Hungary. And so I used Hungarian oak barrels that had a decent amount of age on them, aged it in there, and it's probably one of the most impressive wines. And I don't talk that much about my own wines, but it is one of the most impressive experimental wine grapes that I've seen out of all of them so far, because it is very reminiscent of what you would see from Rosso di Montalcino or Rosso di Montefalco, Sagrantino di Montefalco. It's very similar to those wine grapes and styles of wine. And so that's what I tried to do. I did this with Saperavi. I fermented it in clay pots. Those clay pots are made here in Oregon by Novum Ceramics, up there on Parrot Mountain by Andrew Beckham of Beckham Estates. So I fermented my Saperavi in clay and then aged it in clay, just exactly like they do in the Republic of Georgia. So I'm trying with all these different varietals is to try as best as I can to make these wines as they would kind of where they're grown, where they're known to be known from, and do that here in Oregon to really understand what is possible here. And so far, with few exceptions, almost everything works and works well. The Swiss grapes I work with, Gare Noir, that has got incredible potential here because it's also disease resistant. So you don't have to spray it for powdery mildew, which is the biggest challenge we have here in Oregon. So that is a sustainable product to grow. The Austrian and Hungarian grapes that I work with, Keckfrankosch, Blaufränkisch, it's the same grape. Gruner Veltliner, we have in the northern part of the Willamette Valley, at least, we have a predominance of loess soils, There's a lot of that in Eastern Oregon, a lot of that in Eastern Washington as well. And so we can get closer to the original, if you will, without having to force anything. When you look around the Willamette Valley, there's a lot of forcing of Burgundian style wines instead of exploring what Oregon Pinot Noir actually is. And this happens down in Napa too. They're trying to force what Bordeaux tastes like by continuing to irrigate, over extraction, not letting the old grapes that used to be there flourish. They are trying to, basically jam a square, into a round hole, and it doesn't always work. It works for a short period of time, but after a while, this concept or these concepts are going to collapse unless we start making some agricultural changes.
Mm-hmm. You're gonna have to remind me because you know better than me about all your labels, but you have a Cabernet Sauvignon. What's that label? Do you know what I'm talking about?
I do.
Bordeaux.
I make a wine called Bordeaux.
That's
exactly
what it's called.
Yeah.
Can you tell me about that and relative to what you just said? Like, how is that wine? Where do you source the grapes, and how is that like a Willamette Valley cab? Do you know what I'm asking?
Gorge, isn't it?
That's from the Gorge?
Yeah.
Okay.
Correct. It's from the Gorge.
Okay.
So for me, when I was getting into the wine industry, prior to even making wine, I really cut my teeth by visiting Bordeaux frequently. I worked for two Frenchmen here in Portland. One of them was from Bordeaux, and we used to travel there a couple times a year, and we would put our own proprietary blends together in Bordeaux and then import them into Portland and sell them at our wine shops and certain restaurants. And so I got, a really early schooling from a lot of, really famous Bordeaux producers of what that tastes like. And it was much different than what was going on in modern California wine growing. But if you've ever had a chance to try older California wines or older Napa wines, the wines that, won the Judgment of Paris apparently, those wines are eerily similar to each other. They are in that 12.5% to 13% alcohol range. There's aromatics. They're lighter. They're not so dark and black. They have a finesse that a lot of modern wines don't have anymore. And so I had zero interest in making red Bordeaux. I was already making white Bordeaux, and I thought I was, plenty happy with that. And I had visited this vineyard really to look at some of these really crazy grapes that apparently were being grown there, and I didn't believe it. I thought I was being catfished, to be quite honest with you. I answered this guy's email, was off a Craigslist ad. It seemed kind of sketchy, and I'm like, hey, I'm going to be there tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., send me your address. And he's like, here it is. And I show up there like less than 12 hours after I'd received this email. And sure enough, first thing I wanted to do was go look at this Separavi that he claimed that he had. And he's like, well, I need to show you my, Cabernet Sauvignon block. And I'm like, oh God, I don't want to, what do I want to do with Cab Sauv? Come on, that's not a cool grape. And so, if you want to see the good stuff, sometimes you have to, placate and like, all right, let's go see your Cabernet Sauvignon. And so as we're walking through these Cabernet vines, he's talking to me about all these clonal differences and cluster shape, and he's talking about old Bordeaux styles wine to me. He used to taste them a lot. He was a long time wine rep in New York City, and as he's talking to me about these things, all these memories just come rushing towards me about all these Bordeaux wines I've had and times drinking old Napa wines, and just these memories started flooding me, and these experiences started kind of become reawakened. And so I just could see and I could feel what he was talking about. And so, it didn't take long after looking at all the other experimental vines. He did have a little bit of talking me into it, but it wasn't too much. I was like, I really, really am starting to think that we can do this style of wine in Oregon. And sure enough, 2018 was the first time I made that. And, it's shocking what was able to be achieved. You look at where classic Cabernet Sauvignon is grown. It's grown on the banks of rivers. And most of Napa is not a river. This particular vineyard that I sourced from you can see the Columbia River from the vineyard, and it is eerily similar to great places like in certain parts of Veneto, Italy, where there's some extraordinary Cabernet Sauvignon. And so I took a stab at it, and I fermented it just like they would in Bordeaux, and the results really, really speak for themselves. I'm really struck by what that wine has become, what it continues to be, and hopefully now with more age on the vines, it'll showcase itself even more.
I like the idea of just finding your grapes on Craigslist.
I mean, there's some weirder stories about how I've gotten some of my grapes, but yeah, that was one of them. Yeah, because the guy claimed, "Oh, I've got a vineyard in Forest Grove as well," and I'm like, "I make my wine in Forest Grove. I've never seen a vineyard like this," and it is definitely a hidden vineyard, and it's a wild story. And a lot of people are like, "How did you meet this guy?" I'm like, I cannot explain it to you other than it was the hand of Dionysus. It brought two crazy wine people together. One grows grapes, the other tries to make it into wine. And he's an incredible man with incredible vision. He's got a long history of growing grapes in upstate New York, as well as selling wine in New York City. And he was, from afar, a believer in the potential, a wider potential of what was possible in Oregon. And one of those points that he had why he came here is because he could dry farm. He didn't have to irrigate to force the grape into ripening perfectly in a certain area. It's really I try to tell people it's really no different than growing any kind of produce. So anybody who grows their own tomatoes can taste the difference between a homegrown tomato and a hothouse tomato. Something that's grown in water tastes quite diluted. Yes, you can grow tons of it, but it tastes like nothing. Mm-hmm. And a homegrown tomato just got that extra sweetness, those extra layers of flavors. Wine grapes are no different. And so this is one of the main reasons why he came here. It's all about taste. It's all about potential and taste. And we have all of the ingredients to do that here in Oregon.
I see that the religion was creeping back in there.
Yeah, you've always almost convinced me of that.
Yeah. We should go and worship at the Temple of Dionysus.
We all should. We'd be much happier.
We'll be by later, yeah.
Yeah.
This is a Sunday, so. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if that's the day. I just assumed.
Well, it wasn't called Sunday School Wine for nothing. Right?
It kind of was, but that's a different story. I guess we better wrap this up.
Well, let's see. I'm going to ask you one last question.
Okay, sure.
Or maybe two questions.
Mm-hmm.
And you can answer one or either, whatever strikes your fancy. So is there anything that within Oregon wine history, the entire from the retired fur trappers on, or previous to that, anything that's like, oh man, I wish I knew that one thing, like the one little missing piece that you're just so curious about? Or second question is, is there one thing that you're always coming back to, or that's something that you do know that you're like, that is just so cool?
I think for me, I mean, I'll answer the second part. For me, it's just as I continue to do more and more research, and/or people send me information, it's so impressive to me how vast and how exciting of a wine industry that we had prior to Prohibition here, and the diversity of grapes that we had back then. I have this incredible audio recording of Charles Corey being interviewed by the famous author Ivan Duig, and he was talking about, when he came up here, they didn't really know that there was a wine history here. It wasn't until Mr. Corey went down to the archives down at Oregon State University, which used to be known as the Oregon Agricultural College, did he find out that, a lot of those old farmers were growing grapes exactly like he was about to grow here in Oregon. It was fascinating to learn that even 50 years removed from everything, that many of the same processes they were doing prior to Prohibition were exactly what we would be doing at that time in the 60s and the 70s. Mm-hmm. And so, it gives me lots of encouragement. I don't look at the last 50 years as some jumping off point like most people do. To me, I get really excited when I dig deep and I see how many different grapes that they were planting back then and making wine into. It shows you it was possible. If it was possible in the 1800s, it's definitely possible now. And the scourge of Prohibition has really kind of prevented us from being where we probably should be. We have the responsibility, at least my generation and others, to hit the reset button and to really explore what was already happening there and exploring further what we can do. Because again, I can't stress it enough. It is one of the greatest wine regions in the world. We just need to allow ourselves to come out of this these grape handcuffs, if you will, of just working with essentially 3 grapes. It is the biggest weakness that we have. Our greatest strength is our ability to grow a diverse range of products. We do that in pretty much every other agricultural industry here. Wine and grapes have we decided that we're just going to put ourselves in one little basket and try to force that to be something that maybe it can't be.
Mm-hmm.
I think the future is bright for Oregon. And despite what a lot of people say that I'm negative towards Pinot Noir, it's because I'm so positive about what Oregon wine can be. Oregon wine doesn't have to be one thing. It shouldn't be one thing. And I'm going to fight to ensure that it doesn't become diluted into one particular grape.
Release us of our grape handcuffs. I love that image.
Okay.
It's a new t-shirt design.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's going to be good.
That was a good one.
Yeah.
All right, we better wrap it up.
Thank you so much. Can you tell our listeners where to get your wines and all 45 of them?
Sure. Well, they're not 45 different wines, thankfully. I'm not that crazy. But yeah, you can visit my website, which is goldencluster.com, or follow me on the social medias at Golden Cluster. You can find me whenever we're allowed to reopen again. I'll be at Le Cave, lots of different private dinner parties around Portland. And yeah, go visit your local independent wine retailer. They'll most likely be the first people that are given the opportunity and the chance to support my wines. They won't be most likely at your local grocery store.
Thank you so much.
Well, thanks
Jeff,
for having me.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Jeff here of Golden Cluster. And thank you for listening. This was Sunday School Wine Radio. Go to sundayschoolwine.com to find out more about our membership and wine classes and what else we have coming up. And we will see you next time.